You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Welcome back to The Andrew Lawton Show. Well, what has been one of the most common refrains of the last few years? Some variation of trust the science or follow the science, as though science is this universal and clear oracle that we can all take our cues from on anything and everything. Well, was science itself the problem in a way? There was a fascinating essay from the C2C journal written by public policy analyst Margaret Kapala that makes that very point. The essay is called A Pandemic Caused by Science, with I've tried to do the inflection there so as to indicate the question mark at the end of the piece's title there, but it was a fascinating read, and I thought I would dig into it with Margaret herself, who joins me now. Margaret, wonderful to talk to you. Thanks so much for coming on today.
My pleasure.
Now, let's talk first off about what it is you're referring to. When you say or suggest that science itself may have been to blame, what are you getting at?
The crux of the argument boils down to the use of a technology called gain-of-function science. And what gain-of-function is, it involves the pulling together of different viruses and taking out different bits of them, splicing and dicing them so that you come up with the worst and worst of each virus. So you end up with a synthetic virus that has the attributes of the other two. Now, in this case, it does look, it is near certainty that gain-of-function technology was involved in the whatever was going on at the Wuhan labs and between American and Chinese scientists in Wuhan, working on this mysterious virus, which turned out in the end to have all the properties of SARS-CoV-2, which, of course, as we know, was the final cause of COVID-19.
Let's talk about that lab for a moment, because at the beginning, we were all told that the culprit was a bat or a pangolin, basically, was some, horrendous twist of fate that led to a very unfortunate situation at one of the wet markets in Wuhan. And very early on, people were skeptical of that and suggested that this could have been a creation of a lab intentionally or unintentionally leaked. And what was fascinating with that argument is that as more and more evidence mounted, this thing that was a conspiracy theory at some point in 2022 or 2020 has effectively become an accepted fact, or at least the most plausible scenario here. Now, do we know anything beyond that as far as, was this carelessness? Was it perhaps intentional?
Difficult to say. Everybody is erring on the side of giving the Chinese a lot of leeway. That is, that it was an accidental release or an accidental leak. Release implies it wasn't accidental, an accidental leak. And certainly, whether this is done in the name of prudent geopolitical maneuvering, or whether it's another kind of cover up, we won't ever know. My sense is that both the Chinese and the Americans are caught in a stalemate of mutual culpability. That is, in the sense that we know for certain that the Americans funded the work that was going on in Wuhan through a series of elaborate and arcane roundabout ways of getting money to Wuhan through an intermediary called Eco Health Alliance, an NGO. So the Americans financed it. There are people coming out and saying that boldly, although not everybody. The official word from the American government is that they had nothing to do with it. But there are some who are being intellectually honest, like, for instance, Robert Redfield, who was the former director of the Center for Disease Control, of one of the arch agencies within the American government on the health side, who is saying out loud and in your face, we funded it. And then on the other hand, you had the work that was going on in Wuhan, which is not being denied by the Chinese. Xi Zhengli, who is the chief scientist, again, a geneticist, a very an accomplished geneticist, again, who's good at the splicing and the dicing of genes. And she's not denying that they did the work there, but she is denying that it was their fault or that it was ever leaked. And she's saying, no, it came from the bats over in this mine, and that was the real source. At least that's the last excuse I've heard from her on this one. So, but yes, now, in all fairness, it made a lot of sense to think in the first instance that it might have come from an animal or bat host. This is where a lot of pandemics have come from. This is what the Spanish flu was originated with, flea infested rodents, and then jumped to humans. So this is not abnormal for this kind of thing to happen. I mean, just even think in terms of rabies. I mean, that's a virus that jumps to a human from an animal. So, I mean, it made sense for a lot of people to think that right away. So fair enough. But, getting down to brass tacks and getting into the science of the actual virus itself, and the fact that it has certain genetic components, which now other scientists have sliced and diced and said, hey, wait a minute, this looks like it was pretty well man-made. And now, even since the writing of my article, there has been additional information has come out. You'll remember in the article I refer to two key scientific papers. Nobody was hiding this, by the way, that this science was going on. Papers dating way back to 2005. They were looking for viruses in bats, and the Zhengli and a renowned geneticist located in the University of North Carolina, Ralph Barrick. They had been working together for quite some time on stuff like this. So nobody was being untoward or trying to hide anything here. There were two papers that were absolutely devastating. One that simply said, hey, we've created this great thing, a chimera. We figured out how to put two viruses together to come up with a virus that's even worse. And in this case, it was pulling together the elements of the SARS virus, which caused the pandemic in 2002 to 2004. They took that virus and then spliced and diced it with another virus. We're not sure where that one came from. And lo and behold, it came out looking an awful lot like SARS-CoV-2, or at least became SARS-CoV-2.
I want to just go back to the fundamentals here, because, I mean, it's easy when you're talking about a term that's not familiar to people, which I think gain of function is certainly, or a few years ago was not familiar to a lot of people. And you're describing the function very, very calmly and very accurately. But a lot of people would hear this and be like, what on earth would you expect to happen if you're mucking around in the engine room like that? And I'm wondering, what are the noble intentions of this? If there were to be any, is it about trying to understand the virulence of these things to protect against them? Because certainly it's easy to understand in a military context or a biowarfare context what the value of this is. What's their defense for why they're doing this research in the first place, and why it justifies the alliance between United States scientists and Chinese scientists?
Well, ostensibly, it was to create the gain of function is justified by the argument that if you create a virus, then you can create the vaccine that will address it if it ever, whatever reason, becomes.
But you are willing the virus into existence that might never have appeared in doing that. Yeah.
What's the point is here we are dealing with a virus that never would have existed unless these scientists had put it together in the first place. So hey, reading the second paper, the diffuse paper, I refer to two papers. The second paper that came out, and actually new information has just come out since I wrote the article. And again, what they were apparently what they argued that they were trying to do was they were trying to put together a virus that would reinfect bats and make them in turn immune and unable to then pass on the virus. Okay, there was some sort of immunological thing that they were hoping to achieve where bat populations were concerned, because bats are the largest population of mammals that harbor the coronavirus. And I mean, and there are all kinds of coronaviruses. There are over 200 have been recognized, but I mean, apparently there are estimates there are in the thousands of the kinds of coronaviruses that are out there, and some with varying degrees of lethality. So that was one argument about why it was necessary to do this. The second argument, and the more common one, is that that it's there to create, you create something so that you can create a vaccine to deal with it. And now you can see how this would make sense in a military in a military context. I mean, if you've got people out there, enemies, who are developing their own biological warfare, biological weapons, and you've got to try to anticipate what the heck they are going to hit you with, and so you want to come up with a vaccine that's actually going to deal with it all. That makes some sense. But there was a point. But the bigger risk is in all of that is, in the course of doing this, you end up with what we ended up with COVID.
Well, and also just to jump in there, Margaret, if I may, I mean, the idea of developing that to protect against what your enemies may do with China, who maybe we don't call an enemy, but is certainly not a friend, does not strike me as the wisest course of that. And I mean, in Canada, we've certainly seen front and center about what happens when you let people affiliated with the Chinese regime into our top security labs.
Absolutely. So no, none of this makes any sense whatsoever. I mean, and there are various theories about why and how this might have taken place, that it was a CIA covert operation of some kind. We were trying to figure out what was going on in their labs, and they
the joke's on us.
They ended up, as usual, with our technology, right?
Yeah.
So now they have all this gain of function technology with which, and I'm sure they're underway. The gain of function technology, Xi Zhengli knows everything that Ralph Barrett knows, and hey, and she's the coronavirus authority. She can actually go out. I mean, she's got immediate access to all kinds of bats. There are a prodigious number of bat caves in China. So none of it really makes a lot of sense, and which is all the more worrying, because if you could ascribe some clear motive to what was going on, it might be easier to deal with. The one thing that is clear out of all of this is, what do we do about these gain of function labs? Because this is going on everywhere. It's not just in China. As Redfield pointed out, universities everywhere are playing around, tinkering around with these viruses and these kinds of technologies. And yes, there are leaks are routine. These are not, I didn't mention that in the article, but I mean, I think there was something like 200 lab leaks every few years. And okay, they don't count to anything, but one might. And
all it takes is one, right?
That's right. Absolutely. So yes. Now, I mean, the other side of the whole equation is not just that this virus was created and somehow rather got out into the world. The other side of the equation is how the world reacted then. And that's equally disturbing. I found that very disturbing as well.
Well, yes, and that, I mean, has been covered exhaustively on this show, not nearly enough by, I would say, legacy media sources, and C2C Journal and yourself have been very strong on that. And it's easy to point the finger at, the American government and, the Fauci regime and all of that, and certainly easy to point the finger at the Chinese. Canada has never been immune from this, no pun intended. I mean, I mentioned the case of Canada and China cooperating at that biolab in Winnipeg, but Canada has been a part of a lot of these, cross-cultural exchanges of research as well, has it not?
Yes, absolutely, and I mean, and it looks like we're going to get even more if the WHO pandemic treaty goes through, because they'll be calling on everybody, all the global partners, to go get out there and gather up their viruses and send them into their labs, and by the way, send them also to the WHO, where the major pharmaceutical companies will, of course, have a lot of fun with them as well. We'll see it all over again. So this is very disturbing. And I if at one level, certainly the big issue that needs to be discussed here is whether or not we should be doing this stuff at all. President Obama called a moratorium on gain-of-function research. Well, it was at that point then that they figured out how to use an NGO to get the funding to another part of the world to keep doing it anyway.
Yeah, they just start outsourcing it at that point, and it makes it worse because you lose that oversight and transparency that nominally existed, right?
Exactly. So, so there was that certain big downside from that. But the question then becomes, well, how do you monitor this? How do you check for safety and what have you? Incidentally, what we do know about Wuhan is that most of the work was done in substandard biosafety securities labs. They had a fabulous new lab, a BSL, highest level safety, a new lab had been built very recently, but it turns out most of the work on the SARS viruses were being done in biosafety lab 2 and 3. So again, how do you monitor? How do you keep track of all of this? And why are we allowing this? So
there are, reading and reviewing the voluminous evidence to date, there are really two paths that are facing governments. You could look at this and say what you're saying, which is this is a cautionary tale. We should not do this type of research, not put ourselves in this position again. But I fear that too many lawmakers and so-called experts are doing the opposites and saying, see, this is why we need to do the research. This is why we need to do it. And they're looking at the same premise. And correct me if I'm wrong, Margaret, but they're drawing the opposite conclusion.
Exactly. And as Redfield says, the next pandemic will come from a lab somewhere and it'll be worse. And who knows whether or not we can or will be ready for it. Let's hope we are. And heaven knows we've have a lot of salutary lessons to be obtained from our past experience here. Not least that individual health authorities really need to drill down and decide and, take all this information in and decide really where they stand on it. Because what ended up happening last time was the Americans and the pharmaceutical companies ran slipshod over everybody. And without offering fully tested vaccines, and of course we're still paying for that, and we're likely to pay for that for a long time with our health conditions. So there's a lot to think about here, and I'm hoping that our health authorities are having this discussion, and our governments are having these discussions, and at the most local level, which is where these discussions have to take place and where decisions need to take place. I'm a great believer in subsidiarity. Decisions at the local level, not at the global level, for sure. But that's
we can all agree on that, I would hope. A Pandemic Caused by Science is an essay in C2C journal you could read, written by Margaret Coppola, who's with me now. Margaret, thank you so much for your time on this. Really appreciate it.
Good to be here. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.